My daughter called me 3 days before her wedding and told me I wouldn't be sitting in the front row. Not because the seating was full. Not because of a venue limitation. Because her fiancé's family would be more comfortable if I wasn't there. She said it carefully, apologetically. The way a person speaks when the decision is already made and the call is just the paperwork. I listened to every word. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. When she finished explaining how beautiful the service area view would be, I told her I understood and I ended the call. My name is Idella Odom. I have been preparing the dead for burial in Atlanta, Georgia for 31 years. I run Odom Family Funeral Services, built from nothing alongside my late husband Ernest, one family at a time, one grief at a time. I have sat across from mothers who buried children, wives who buried husbands, children who weren't ready. I have learned how to hold weight without showing the strain. So when my daughter called to tell me her new husband's comfort mattered more than my seat at her wedding, I did not fall apart. I set the phone down on my desk and looked at Ernest's photograph, the one I keep beside the window, him standing in front of the building the first year we opened. He's laughing at something off camera. He always looked like that, like something good was always just out of frame. I thought about what he built, what we built. Odom Family Funeral Services isn't just a business. In 31 years, it has become something people trust with the most sacred thing they have: the body of someone they loved. 3 generations of Atlanta families have walked through our doors. That trust doesn't transfer. It doesn't survive the wrong hands. And Zach Mercer had been studying those hands since the night I first saw him. I noticed things about Zach that Moselle didn't see, or wouldn't. The way he smiled at me across a dinner table while asking questions that had no reason to be asked unless he already knew the answers. The way his interest in our family always circled back, eventually, to the business. He was charming in the way that requires practice, warm in the way that costs something to maintain. I told Moselle once, calmly, specifically, privately. She made her choice, so I made mine. I didn't make it that afternoon when she called. I had been making it quietly for 4 months, piece by piece, document by document, with a steadiness that Ernest would have recognized. He used to say I was the only person he knew who could grieve and plan at the same time. He meant it as a compliment. Sitting in that office, I wasn't grieving anymore. The grief had finished its work. What was left was something cleaner, cooler. The part of me that knows how to handle what cannot be undone. If this story is speaking to something you've carried, stay with me. Drop something in the comments. You don't have to explain it. I'll understand. I looked at Ernest one more time. Then I picked up my phone. Not to call Moselle back. Not to argue or beg or warn her again. I had one call left to make. One I had been holding in reserve since the day I understood exactly what Zach Mercer came into our lives to take. I pulled up the number. I pressed call. And everything that happened after that was already decided. I saw Zach Mercer before my daughter ever spoke his name. It was a Friday evening, late October, outside a restaurant on Peachtree Road in Buckhead. I had finished a late dinner with a colleague and was walking to my car when I heard it, not shouting. Something quieter than that. A woman's voice, pressed down low, the kind of low that isn't a choice. I turned without thinking. He had her by the arm. Not violently. That's what made it register the way it did. It was controlled. His grip, his posture, his expression, all of it was controlled. He was smiling slightly while he held her, speaking close to her ear, and she was nodding the way a person nods when they are agreeing to end something rather than start it. Then a valet crossed between them carrying keys. The woman looked up for half a second, just long enough for me to see something pass across her face. Relief, maybe. Or the expectation of relief. The kind of look people get when another person enters a conversation they hadn't realized they wanted to leave. The valet kept walking. Whatever she had expected disappeared with him. Her eyes dropped again. I stood still. He never saw me. She never looked up again. I noted his face the way I note things in my line of work, not with judgment, just with accuracy. Height, build, the particular stillness of a man who is used to being obeyed in quiet places. I filed it, and I walked to my car. 6 weeks later, Moselle brought him to Sunday dinner. He walked in wearing a gray blazer, carrying wine he had clearly researched, and he moved through my home like a man who had already measured it. He shook my hand and held it 1 beat longer than necessary, and when his eyes found mine across the table, they stayed there just long enough to ask a question he never said out loud. He was deciding if I was a threat. I gave him nothing. I smiled, I passed the bread, I asked him ordinary questions and listened to his answers with my full attention, because the answers weren't what I was listening to. I was listening to the shape of how he spoke about money, about the future, about Moselle's life and what he imagined it becoming. By dessert, I knew enough. That night, after Moselle left the kitchen to take a call, I sat across from her at the table and I told her, quietly, without drama, what I had seen in that parking lot in October. I described him precisely. The woman, the grip, the smile. Moselle went still. Then she said I must have been mistaken, that Zach wasn't the kind of man who behaved that way, that I had always been protective to the point of unfairness, and this was that same pattern showing up again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just closed a door behind her eyes that I felt more than saw. And by the time we said goodnight, we were speaking from opposite sides of something that had no name yet. I didn't chase her through that door. I have learned, in my work, that you cannot force someone to see what they are not yet ready to look at. You can only make sure you are still standing when they are. What Moselle didn't know was that she hadn't been the only one at that table watching Zach Mercer. Theron Bowen had been there, my late husband's oldest friend, Deacon, a man who had spent 20 years in Atlanta civic life and knew its social geography the way I knew its grief. He had been quiet through most of dinner. But when Moselle stepped away from the table, I noticed him looking at Zach with a concentration that hadn't been there earlier. After Zach and Moselle left, Theron lingered behind while I cleared plates. Finally, he said, "I swear I've seen that man somewhere before." Not a certainty, not a story, just the uneasy recognition of a face that had landed in the wrong place inside his memory. I looked at him steadily. "Where?" He shook his head. "I don't know yet." That answer bothered him more than it bothered me. Theron wasn't a man who forgot people easily. 20 years in civic work meant thousands of names, meetings, fundraisers, church events, board gatherings, and public forums. He remembered faces the way other people remembered phone numbers. The fact that he couldn't place Zach immediately meant he would keep trying until he did. I knew that about him, and he knew I knew it. So neither of us said anything else. A few seconds later, I handed him his coat. He took it, paused at the door, and looked back. "If I've seen him before," he said, "I'll find out where." I nodded. And that was where it actually began. The call I made at the end of that afternoon was to Josette Brooke. Not the first call, the last one. Josette has handled Odom Family Funeral Services legal and estate work for 11 years. She is precise, unhurried, and she does not ask unnecessary questions. When I came to her 4 months ago and told her what I needed, she listened to the whole thing without interrupting. I told her about the engagement. I told her about the parking lot. I told her about the questions Zach had already begun asking regarding ownership structures, succession, and how family businesses passed from one generation to the next. Then she said, "Give me a week to draw up the framework." That was all. What we completed on the morning of the wedding was not built that morning. Every document had been drafted, reviewed, revised, and held in readiness for weeks. The call I made was not an instruction. It was a signal. The work was already done. I was telling her to close it. Here is what was at stake. Moselle held a 28% ownership interest in Odom Family Funeral Services, written into the original business structure when Ernest and I first formalized the company. It was always meant to be hers. It still is. But the greater risk was not Moselle's ownership itself. The greater risk was everything around it: control, succession, voting authority, future transfers, the mechanisms that determine who eventually influences a business and under what circumstances. A man who married Moselle could not simply take ownership of what belonged to her, but with the right attorney and enough patience, he could position himself close to decisions he had no business touching. He could make himself relevant to conversations he had not earned the right to enter. Zach Mercer had been asking questions about funeral home ownership structures in Georgia since before the engagement ended. Not enough to accuse him of anything. More than enough to make me pay attention. I didn't know the full extent of it yet, but I knew enough. What Josette built was not a transfer of Moselle's interest. It was a restructuring of everything I still controlled. The succession provisions attached to my majority interest were rewritten. Future transfer rights were tightened. Voting authority remained exactly where it belonged. New restrictions were placed on who could acquire influence through marriage, divorce, assignment, or indirect claim. Moselle's ownership remained untouched. Mine did not. Under Georgia law, the structure was entirely legitimate because I was modifying interests I already owned and controlled. The result was simple. The business could still pass to my daughter. It simply could not pass through my daughter to someone else. What Josette built was a wall with Moselle's name written on the gate and Zach's name nowhere on the property. I did not tell Moselle I was doing this. I need anyone listening to understand that decision clearly, because I know how it sounds. A mother quietly restructuring the future of a family business without discussing it with her daughter sounds controlling. It wasn't. In fact, when I first raised the issue with Josette, she asked me a question. "If nothing happens," she said, "does this hurt Moselle in any way?" The answer was no. Moselle kept every ownership right she already possessed, every benefit, every future opportunity attached to her interest. The only thing changing was who could eventually reach those things through her. That answer settled it for both of us. If I had told Moselle, she would have told Zach not to betray me, but because that is what a woman does when she trusts the man she is about to marry. She would have mentioned it in passing, or he would have sensed something had changed and asked until she told him. And the moment Zach knew what I was building, he would have adjusted. Silence was the only protection that held. That is the part I knew Moselle would struggle to forgive. Not what I did, but that I did it without her knowing. I carried that weight with both hands and I did not put it down. Josette's voice on the phone was even. "Execution is complete. Everything's filed and recorded as of this morning." I thanked her. She paused. The kind of pause Josette takes when she has something else and is deciding how to frame it. "There's something else," she said. "While reviewing public records connected to the restructuring, I came across something involving Mercer. I don't have the full picture yet, but there's a civil matter in Fulton County that doesn't sit right. I want to look at it more closely." The room was quiet. "Look at it," I said. She said she would call me when she had more. I set the phone down and sat with what I had just set in motion, and what I now understood might be larger than I had originally seen. I got dressed anyway. That is the first thing I want to say about that morning. I was raised by a woman who believed you put yourself together regardless of what the day was asking of you. So I pressed my clothes, I fixed my hair, and I sat down at my kitchen table at 7:45 in the morning like I had somewhere to be. I didn't. I made myself eat. Eggs I barely tasted. Coffee I finished because wasting it felt like one loss too many. Outside, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does on a Saturday in spring. Neighbors walking dogs. A car stereo 2 streets over. The ordinary world moving through an ordinary morning that had no idea what it was carrying. I knew exactly where Moselle was. I knew what time her hair appointment had been scheduled. I knew the color of her dress because I had seen the photograph she sent me 4 months ago, before things shifted between us. Ivory, with a draped back. She would be beautiful. She always is. I sat in my kitchen and I did not go. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was too hurt to move. I didn't go because showing up would have meant walking into a room where I had been deliberately placed out of sight. And I have never in my life made myself small for a man who hadn't earned my respect. I was not about to start on my only daughter's wedding day. I had composed the text 3 days earlier, the night of Moselle's call. I wrote it, read it once, and saved it without sending. Because I needed Josette's confirmation before those words arrived. The legal work had to be closed first. The text was the last piece, not the first. At 10:12 that morning, with Josette's confirmation already logged from the day prior, I opened my phone. 11 words. You'll understand why you no longer have access. I want to be clear about what that sentence meant, because I was clear about it when I wrote it. It was not a threat. It was not cruelty dressed up as a message. What Moselle no longer had access to was not her inheritance. It was the old version of the future. The version where the business remained exposed through structures that had never been designed with someone like Zach Mercer in mind. The version where a determined outsider could slowly position himself closer and closer to decisions that did not belong to him. What remained was everything I had spent 4 months protecting: the business, its future, and ultimately, her place in it. But standing where she was that morning, Moselle would read it as a door closing, and Zach would read it differently. Over the previous months, he had asked too many questions not to. Ownership structures, succession, voting authority, how family businesses survived one generation and reached the next. Always casually. Always wrapped inside larger conversations. But enough that a man paying attention would understand exactly what a sentence like that implied. Access was the word he had been circling the entire time. I sent it. I set the phone face down on the table. 37 seconds later, it moved. Not Moselle. Zach. The speed of it told me more than the call itself. Moselle should have received the text first. She was the recipient. Yet somehow, Zach was calling me less than a minute after I sent it. That meant he was beside her. It meant he had seen the message. And it meant the meaning had landed immediately. He called 3 times in 11 minutes. 3 times I watched his name appear on the screen, and I did not move. The 4th call went to voicemail. I waited 60 seconds. Then I pressed play, and I listened. His first sentence was composed, measured, the version of himself he showed the world. By the second sentence, something had shifted. A tightness in his voice that the charm couldn't cover. He asked what exactly I meant. Not what Moselle meant. Not whether she was upset. Not why I wasn't attending the wedding. What exactly I meant. By the end of the message, even that restraint was gone, replaced by something quieter and uglier, the sound of a man recalculating in real time. He didn't threaten me. He didn't have to. What he said without meaning to say it was enough. He knew exactly what access meant. He was not calling because he was confused. He was not calling because he was hurt. He was calling because something he had expected to reach one day had suddenly moved farther away. I saved the voicemail. I pressed the phone face down again. Outside, Atlanta kept moving. Inside, I sat with what I had just confirmed. For the first time since I met Zach Mercer, there was no longer any doubt. The text had reached the right person. He had never been there for my daughter. 2 days after the wedding, I called Theron Bowen. Not to grieve, not to be talked off a ledge. I called him because I had one specific question that had been sitting underneath everything else since that October night in Buckhead. And Theron was the only person I trusted to help me find the answer without making it into something larger than it needed to be. Theron has been in my life since before Ernest passed. They came up together. Same church, same neighborhood, same generation of Atlanta men who built things quietly and didn't need recognition for it. After Ernest died, Theron stepped into the particular kind of friendship that doesn't require explanation. He checked on the business without being asked. He showed up. 20 years as a city council liaison taught him how Atlanta actually works. Not the version in press releases, but the version that runs on relationships, memory, and who knows what about whom. When I told him what I needed, he didn't ask why. He already knew part of it. After the engagement dinner, he had gone home and sat with what he'd seen. The way Zach moved through a room, the questions underneath his questions. He told me he had started making quiet inquiries the same week. Not because I asked him to, because he is the kind of man who, once he says, "I know that man," takes that seriously. What bothered him, he said, was not Zach's face. It was a habit. At dinner, every conversation somehow drifted back toward ownership. The business, growth, succession, long-term plans. Not enough to seem inappropriate, just enough to register. Theron said he had heard that pattern somewhere before. Not the exact questions, the same interest, the same destination. He told me about a community development forum 2 years prior. Zach had been there working the room the way he always worked rooms, warm, visible, strategic. There was a woman with him, young. She stood close but said almost nothing, and when a colleague of Theron's asked her directly what she did for work, Zach answered before she finished drawing breath. Smooth, reflexive, the kind of thing you only notice if you're already watching. Then, later that same afternoon, Theron overheard Zach asking a property owner questions that had nothing to do with the event itself. Ownership percentages, future transfers. What happened when a business passed from one generation to another? At the time, it meant nothing. Looking back, it bothered him. Theron had watched. He filed it. He didn't know yet what he was filing it for. That afternoon, he made calls. His church network, 2 former council colleagues, a woman named Betrayal, who coordinates vendor relationships for community events across the city. By 6 o'clock, he called me back. He had a name. Avia Coles. I wrote it down on the notepad I keep beside my office phone, the same pad where I write the names of families when they first call. I sat with it the same way I sit with those names. Not rushing, not reaching. Giving the weight of it the space it deserved before I decided what to do next. I didn't know yet what Avia's full story was. I didn't know what she meant to Zach or what he meant to her. What I knew was that she existed, that she had been present in his life at a community event 2 years ago, and that a man who answered questions on her behalf in public was a man who had practiced a particular kind of control long enough to make it look natural. I was still sitting with that when my phone rang again. Theron. He said he almost didn't call back because he wasn't sure it was relevant. But something told him I needed to know. Avia Coles worked at a floral supplier, a company that serviced funeral homes across the Atlanta metro area, including Odom Family Funeral Services. I set my pen down. I had been thinking about how to approach this woman carefully, professionally, without alarming her. I had been thinking about how to create an introduction that felt natural rather than engineered. The introduction already existed. She had been walking through my professional world the entire time, delivering flowers to the same building Ernest built, the same rooms where I had been quietly protecting everything he left behind. The ground was already there. I just hadn't looked down. Before I made contact with Avia Coles, I learned her. Not from a distance the way people mean when they say that. Not surveillance, not suspicion. I listened the way my profession taught me to listen. Carefully, without agenda. Giving what I was hearing room to tell me what it actually meant rather than what I expected it to mean. Through Theron's network, conversations with people who knew her professionally, and the funeral home's own supplier relationships, a picture assembled itself piece by piece over 4 days. Avia had worked at the floral supplier for 3 years, consistently, without gaps, reliable, enough that 2 funeral homes she serviced had requested her specifically for recurring orders. Everyone who mentioned her described the same things: dependable, quiet, rarely late, the kind of employee businesses try hard not to lose. Beyond that, the details became less complete. She had not always lived where she lived now. At least one former address surfaced through casual conversation. Someone mentioned she had moved more than once before settling into her current apartment. No one seemed to know much about her life before the florist job. Not because anything was wrong with it, because she rarely talked about herself. That interested me. Most people leave a trail of stories behind them. Avia seemed to leave very few. I recognized that shape immediately. Not from criminal work, not from investigations, from my work. The actual work of sitting across from people in the worst rooms of their lives. I have seen women come through those doors who flinch when a voice rises unexpectedly in the parking lot. Women who answer a simple question by glancing sideways first, checking something invisible before they speak. Women who have quietly arranged their entire lives around not disturbing something they depend on, because they have learned, through experience, not imagination, what happens when they do. I was not looking at a criminal file. I was looking at a woman who had been managed. I didn't reach out to her directly. That was not the right move, and I knew it. A stranger calling to ask about her private life would close every door before I could explain why I was standing outside it. What I needed was a legitimate reason to be in the same professional space, something that required nothing from her and threatened nothing she was protecting. I placed a flower order for an upcoming service through Avia's company. Nothing unusual. Odom Family Funeral Services ordered from that supplier regularly. I requested the same representative for a follow-up delivery the following week. Clean transaction. Documented in the normal course of business. Nothing that looked like anything other than what it was. I was building a bridge, not setting a trap. Then Prentice called. Wendell Prentice runs a funeral home in Decatur, a good man. 20 years in the business, someone I have known through the Georgia Funeral Directors Association since before Ernest passed. He called on a Tuesday afternoon. His tone, the careful kind people use when they're not sure if what they're about to say is relevant. He said a man had stopped by his funeral home about a week after my daughter's wedding. Well-dressed, pleasant, asking questions that seemed casual, but weren't. He wanted to know how funeral home ownership structures worked in Georgia, what role spouses played in family businesses, how ownership interests were typically handled from one generation to the next. Prentice said the questions struck him as unusual because they weren't the questions families normally ask. They were the questions of someone trying to understand a business from the outside. The visitor gave a name Prentice didn't recognize. Then he described him. I knew before he finished the second sentence. Zach had gone looking for information somewhere other than my funeral home. He couldn't walk into mine and ask those questions. He knew I would hear about it before the day was over. So he had gone somewhere adjacent, somewhere he believed was far enough removed. He was mapping the business from the outside because I had closed the inside to him. I thanked Prentice, kept my voice even, and ended the call. Then I sat very still for a moment. I was ahead of Zach. I knew that. But ahead is not the same as safe. Ahead means the distance between us is real, but it is not fixed. And a man who is already moving does not stop because you are not watching. He was moving, which meant I had to move too. Moselle had called twice since the wedding. Both times brief. Both times the same performance. Everything is fine. Just checking in. Don't worry about me. I let her have those calls. A person needs time to build up to the truth, and pushing before she was ready would only close the door further. The third call was different. She started the same way, light, managed, the careful voice she had been using with me for months. But this time she didn't move off it quickly enough, and underneath the lightness I heard something working. Something turning over slowly, the way a person sounds when they are asking a question they have been coached to make sound casual. She mentioned a supplier name, one connected to the funeral home's accounts. She said she had come across an old invoice. Zach had found it while helping her sort through a box of documents she had brought from her room at the house before the wedding. Pre-restructuring paperwork, years old, but still carrying the business's account relationships in plain language. She said she was just curious how that contract worked. I let a beat pass. Then I asked her one question. Why is Zach interested in the supplier accounts, Moselle? The silence before her answer lasted exactly long enough to tell me everything. He's not interested, Mama. He just wants to understand the family business, to feel like part of things. It came out smooth. Too smooth. The kind of smooth that takes rehearsal. I told her I understood. I kept my voice even and warm, and I did not press further. We spoke for another 4 minutes about nothing consequential and then said goodbye. After I set the phone down, I sat with what had just happened. Zach had found old documents, pre-restructuring paperwork that Moselle had unknowingly carried out of this house in a moving box. His name was on nothing in the new structure. But the old invoices still mapped the business's supplier relationships, its account names, the shape of how the operation ran day to day. He was using those documents the way a man uses an outdated map. Imperfect, but good enough to identify the roads. And he had sent Moselle to ask the questions because she had standing that he didn't. She didn't know that was what she was doing. I am certain of that. She thought she was being a good wife, helping her husband feel connected to her family, smoothing over the distance that had grown since the wedding. She had no idea that every question she asked on his behalf was a piece of intelligence he was assembling without her fingerprints on it. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not that Zach was using her. I had expected that from the beginning. What sat heavy was watching my daughter's love for someone become the instrument of her own exposure, and knowing she couldn't see it yet. She wasn't a villain in this. She wasn't even naive in the ordinary sense. She was a woman whose trust had been borrowed without her consent and spent on something she would never have approved. I gave myself 10 minutes. Then I called Josette. I told her about Prentice in Decatur. I told her about the old documents and the supplier question. She listened without interrupting. The new structure is clean, she said. Nothing he finds in those old papers gives him any legal pathway. He's mapping a building that's already been rebuilt. Then she paused. The same pause she used when she had something else to say. I've finished looking at the Fulton County civil records, she said. Idella, I found something. I tightened my hand around the phone. Tell me. The delivery came on a Thursday morning. I was in my office when I heard the front door, not the family entrance, the supplier entrance on the side of the building. I came out myself, the way I do when I am expecting a specific order for a service. Nothing staged about it. Just a business owner present in her own establishment on an ordinary workday. Avia Coles carried the arrangement in both arms. White lilies and eucalyptus, the kind of clean, dignified display that works for any family regardless of what they are carrying that week. She set it on the receiving table and began checking it against the order form with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned that competence is the safest thing to lead with. I watched her for a moment before I spoke. She moved carefully, not nervously, carefully. There is a difference. Nervous people make small, unnecessary movements. Careful people have learned to take up exactly the space they need, and no more. I have seen that particular economy of movement before, in this building, in people who have spent time managing someone else's volatility. I thanked her for the order. She acknowledged it without quite meeting my eyes. We exchanged the ordinary back and forth of a business transaction, the follow-up delivery date, the preferred arrangement style for the next service, whether the eucalyptus stems held well in the cooler. She was almost at the door when she stopped. Not a hesitation, a decision. There is a difference in that too. She turned back and looked at me directly for the first time since she had walked in. The look was particular, the kind I have seen on people standing in this building who are close to something they cannot name but can feel. Like standing near someone who has already carried what you are carrying and came back upright. "You're Moselle's mother," she said. Not a question. "I am," I said. I asked her, without any pressure in my voice, how she knew me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me. Zach had a photograph on his phone, a family birthday gathering from 2 years ago, Moselle, myself, 2 of Moselle's cousins in the backyard of this house. He had shown it to Avia once while talking about Atlanta, about families with influence, about businesses that lasted, about people who understood how things were done in the city. He had pointed me out specifically, not as an enemy, not as an obstacle, as someone he said was protective of what belonged to her family, someone who asked questions, someone who paid attention. I received that without changing my expression. A man does not spend time discussing a woman's family business with someone he claims has nothing to do with it, unless the business occupies space in his thinking. A man does not repeatedly point out the same person unless that person matters to him in some way. Whether he understood it or not, he had been telling Avia exactly where his attention lived. I thanked her again for the delivery. Professional, unhurried. Avia nodded and turned toward the door. Then she stopped a second time. She didn't turn around. She spoke to the door. Her voice dropped just slightly, the way a person speaks when they are saying something they have been holding for a long time and are not entirely sure their body will let them finish. She said she had thought about calling someone for a long time. She just hadn't known who was safe. Then, after a pause, she added something else. She said every time she thought about speaking up, she remembered that the car was in his name. The apartment depended on his signature. Most of the stability in her life seemed to run through him somehow. She wasn't proud of that. It was simply true. People talk about leaving as though it is a decision. Sometimes it is a math problem. I let her words settle in the room before I answered. "You're welcome back any time," I said. "My door is open." Nothing more than that. No urgency, no ask, no pressure that might startle a woman who had learned to read pressure in all its forms. She left. But she had left something behind that no document could replicate. The knowledge that she was ready. And that she already knew I was the person she had been waiting to find. Avia called 4 days after the delivery. The first call came on a Monday evening, just after 7. She started talking almost immediately, not rushing, but carefully, the way a person speaks when they are listening to their own words in real time, checking each sentence before the next one leaves their mouth. Testing whether it was safe to say things out loud that had only ever lived inside her. I listened without interrupting. I asked nothing during that first call. 20 minutes in, she said she needed to go. I told her I was glad she called. That was all. She called again 2 days later, this time longer. This time the sentences came with less checking between them. By the third call, I had the full picture. Avia was 26 when Zach found her at a community health fair in Southwest Atlanta, the kind of event where vendors set up tables and people circulate with free tote bags and good intentions. She had been in Atlanta 14 months, no family within 4 hours, working the florist job that paid her rent by a margin thin enough that one missed shift could tip everything. She was not struggling dramatically. She was surviving precisely the way a person does when they cannot afford a single unexpected thing. Zach introduced himself as someone who worked in community development. He was warm, interested, unhurried. He remembered details she mentioned in passing and brought them back in later conversations. Within 3 months, he had positioned himself as the most stable thing in her life. And within 5, he had quietly arranged things so that the stability had his name on it, not hers. The car was registered to him. She drove it daily, needed it for work, but it belonged to him on paper. The joint account he opened. He seeded it, managed it, and she quickly understood that withdrawals she made without discussion had consequences that weren't spoken, but were felt. The apartment lease listed him as primary. Her name was on it, but his signature controlled the renewal. She could not leave without losing the floor under her feet. That had not happened by accident. He had been maintaining all of this: the car, the account, the lease, the careful management of her options. The entire time he was courting Moselle. Avia knew about Moselle. Not everything, not at first, but enough. She had seen a message. She had asked him once, directly, to end whatever he had with the other woman and let her go her own way. He returned the car 2 weeks later without explanation. She had spent those 2 weeks getting to work by borrowing a colleague's vehicle and saying nothing to anyone. She did not ask again. I wrote down everything she told me across those 3 calls. Dates, the name of the community health fair, the apartment complex on Campbellton Road, the first 4 digits of the account number she remembered. The specific Wednesday he took the car and the Thursday, 2 weeks later when it reappeared in the parking lot without a word. I was not collecting this for myself. I was collecting it in a form that had shape, the kind of shape that corresponds to records already sitting in other people's systems. Lease agreements, account histories, car registration documents, event attendance logs, things that exist independently of Avia's memory and can therefore stand alongside it. By the end of the 3rd call, I had the outline of a pattern that was documented, specific, and corroborated. Not a story, not an accusation, a record. And the most important thing about a record is not what it says. It is that it cannot be taken back. I closed my notebook. I sat with what Avia had trusted me with, the weight of it, the courage it had taken her to put words to something she had been carrying alone for nearly 2 years. Then I picked up the phone to call Josette. The call came on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the wedding. I knew from the first second, not from what she said. She hadn't said anything yet beyond my name. I knew from the half-breath before it, the particular silence of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for days and has finally run out of arm. Moselle was not performing this time. She told me she was sitting in the car in the parking garage of her building. She said she had driven around for 40 minutes before she stopped. I didn't ask why she hadn't gone upstairs. I understood why. She told me what had happened 2 nights before. She had asked Zach about the joint account, the one they had discussed before the wedding, the one he had deferred twice already since they returned from the honeymoon. She hadn't pushed hard. She said she kept her voice light, almost apologetic, the way she had learned to ask him things that mattered as though they didn't. She just wanted to know when they were going to set it up. He told her it wasn't the right time. She asked what would make it the right time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward her. He went completely still and looked at her. That was all. Just looked at her with an expression she could not name. Something that sat behind his eyes like a door she had never noticed before had just swung open an inch. She said it lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then he said he was tired, and he left the room. He didn't come back until she was already in bed. In the morning, he made her coffee, asked about her day, touched her shoulder when he passed her in the kitchen. Warm, attentive, entirely himself, as if the 4 seconds had never happened. Mama. Her voice was low and steady in the particular way of someone working very hard not to come apart. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't what he did. It was what I felt looking at him. I sat with that sentence for a moment before I answered. I did not say, I told you. I did not mention the text, or Josette, or Avia, or anything I had been building since the morning of the wedding. None of that was what she needed, and none of it was what this call was for. I asked her where she was. She told me, still in the parking garage, engine off now. I asked if she was safe. She said yes, she thought so. She didn't think he would ever. And then she stopped herself mid-sentence. and I heard the exact moment she recognized what she had almost said. She had almost said she didn't think he would ever hurt her. And something in her had stopped her from finishing that sentence, because finishing it would have required her to sit with the fact that she was now a woman who had to think about whether that was true. I let the silence hold. Then I told her I loved her. I told her my door was open. I told her she didn't have to explain anything or decide anything tonight. I just needed her to know the door was open whenever she was ready to walk through it. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes without saying much. Then she said she was going to go upstairs. I told her to call me tomorrow. After the line went quiet, I sat in my office without moving. I had built everything I built because I believed this moment was coming. I had been right about Zach Mercer from the first night I saw his face. Being right had never felt so much like losing something. Josette's office smells like paper and coffee, and the particular quiet of a place where serious things get decided without raised voices. I had been in that office many times over 11 years. For Ernest's estate after he passed, for the business restructuring, for every legal matter the funeral home required. I knew the chair across from her desk, the way the afternoon light came through the blinds and stripes across her files. I knew what it meant when she had a folder open before I sat down. She had a folder open. She let me settle. Then she turned it toward me. Fulton County Civil Records. A judgment filed 2 years before Zach ever introduced himself to Moselle. The plaintiff was a man named Aldous Greer, former business partner, commercial property co-owner, and apparently a man who had made the mistake of trusting Zach Mercer with figures he should have verified himself. Josette walked me through it without rushing. Greer and Zach had co-owned a small commercial property in East Point. When they agreed to sell, Zach handled the valuation process. He presented Greer with numbers that justified an unequal split of the proceeds. Numbers that gave Zach the larger share based on an assessment he had commissioned and controlled. Greer signed. The sale closed. 2 months later, Greer hired an independent appraiser while reviewing records connected to another transaction. The numbers didn't match. Not by a small margin, by enough that Greer filed suit. After reviewing the evidence, the court found that Zach had knowingly misrepresented material information during the sale. Judgment entered for Aldous Greer. $63,000. I looked at the figure on the page. He never paid it, Josette said. Not fully. He's been making periodic payments and negotiating extensions, just enough to avoid more aggressive collection efforts. The judgment is still active, still sitting in public record for anyone who runs the right search. I asked her why it hadn't appeared earlier. When she first began working on the restructuring, she was direct the way she always is. I ran a standard business and ownership review when you first came to me. I was focused on the ownership structure. What standing he could gain through the marriage, how to close that pathway. I wasn't conducting full litigation and civil history research at that stage, because there wasn't a legal reason to. That wasn't the scope. She paused. When Avia's account came through and you told me what she described about his financial behavior, there was a reason to expand the search. The scope changed because the picture changed. She closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it. Here is what this gives us, she said. By itself, the judgment tells the story of a man who manipulates financial arrangements for personal gain and has been willing to do so in a way that resulted in a court finding against him. Combined with Avia's documented account, the parallel relationship maintained throughout the entire engagement, it begins building something specific, a pattern of deception that predates the marriage and runs directly through it. She was careful with her language. This doesn't create grounds for annulment, she said. Georgia courts grant annulments in very limited situations, and fraud alone rarely meets that threshold. What it does create is evidence. If Moselle ultimately decides to end the marriage, This becomes part of the documented history surrounding who Zach represented himself to be, what information was concealed, and how financial relationships were handled before and during the marriage. I nodded. The distinction mattered. Josette wasn't building a dramatic courtroom reveal. She was building a record. Moselle hasn't asked me for any of this, Josette said. I know, I said. But if she ever does… She touched the folder. She won't be starting from zero. I sat with that for a moment. Everything I had gathered since October, the parking lot, the dinner, Theron's calls, Avia's 3 conversations, and now this. It was all assembled, documented, waiting. What sat inside that folder was not proof of every suspicion I had ever held about Zach Mercer. It was something more useful. Evidence. Evidence that showed a documented history of deception, financial manipulation, concealed relationships, and carefully managed appearances. Evidence that could stand on its own, whether anyone believed my instincts or not. Every piece of it was now in that folder. He walked in on a Tuesday morning without calling. My receptionist, Nadine, came to find me in the back hallway where I was reviewing arrangements for a Thursday service. She said there was a man at the front desk asking for me by name. She said he was well-dressed and pleasant, and had the particular ease of someone who expected to be received without waiting. I knew before she finished the description. I told her to let him know I would be right out. I finished what I was doing, not to make him wait, but because I do not leave unfinished work unfinished for anyone. Then I walked out to meet him. He was standing near the entrance, taking in the room with the casual attentiveness of a man making calculations he didn't want to look like he was making. When he saw me, he smiled. Warm, immediate, the full version of the charm he kept polished for situations that required it. Mrs. Odom, he said, thank you for seeing me. I thanked him for coming and led him to the arrangement room. I chose that room deliberately. It is where families sit when they are making decisions about people they have lost. The particular weight of that purpose is in the furniture, in the quiet, in the way the light falls. It is not a threatening room. It is something more unsettling than threatening. It is a room that asks you to be honest about what actually matters. I watched him take it in when he sat down. Something in his posture adjusted, a small recalibration he couldn't fully hide. The room had done what it always does. He told me they had gotten off on the wrong foot. He told me he loved Moselle, and that her happiness was the only thing that mattered to him. He told me he understood there had been tension, and that he hoped they could move forward as family, that he wanted to be the kind of son-in-law I could trust. He was good. I will say that plainly. The words were warm. The posture was open. The eye contact was exactly calibrated, enough to signal sincerity, not so much as to feel like pressure. He had delivered some version of this before to someone else, in some other room. The fluency of it was unmistakable. I let him finish, without interrupting. When he was done, I looked at him quietly for a moment. Then I told him I appreciated him coming. I told him I hoped Moselle was well. I told him my door was always open for my daughter. That was all. I stood up. He didn't move immediately. He stayed seated for one beat longer than the situation called for. The particular stillness of a man who arrived expecting to read a room and discovered instead that the room had been reading him since he walked through the door. His eyes moved across my face, looking for something to work with. A crack. An emotion. An opening he could file away and return to later. There was nothing there. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He thanked me for my time with the same warmth he had carried in, though something underneath it had shifted in a way he couldn't entirely recover. I walked him to the front entrance. Nadine said goodbye from the desk. He nodded pleasantly and left. I stood at the window and watched him cross the parking lot to his car. He didn't look back, but he walked differently than he had walked in. The ease was still there on the surface, but underneath it something was working. Recalculating. He had come to find out if I was afraid of him. He had his answer. And somewhere underneath the recalculation, I knew. That answer had frightened him more than anything else I could have said. I gave Avia one thing: Josette's name, her number, and 2 sentences about what kind of attorney she was and how she worked. I told Avia that Josette was thorough, that she listened without rushing, and that whatever Avia decided to do or not do with that information was entirely her own choice. That was all I offered. Nothing more. I did not go with her. I want to be clear about that because I know how it might look from the outside. A woman with resources and an attorney already in place, guiding someone with far less toward a meeting that served the larger picture. I thought about that carefully before I made the referral. The reason I stayed away was not strategic, though it was also that. It was because Avia's account belonged to Avia. A statement given without me in the room could not be shaped by my presence, my reactions, my history with any of this. What she told Josette needed to come from her own memory, in her own words, with no one else's fingerprints on the telling of it. I gave her the door. She decided whether to walk through it. She walked through it. Josette called me afterward, professionally brief, telling me only that the meeting had taken place and that a formal documented statement had been given. She named nothing specific. That was appropriate. Avia's account was Avia's, and the details of it were between her and her own legal process. Avia called me that evening. Her voice was different from the 3 calls we had shared before. Those calls had the particular texture of someone excavating something carefully, testing the ground as they went. This one was quieter, settled in a way the others hadn't been. She said the meeting had helped her feel like something that had been sitting on her chest for 2 years finally had somewhere to go. I told her I was glad. I meant it without qualification. We were quiet for a moment. Then she said there was something she hadn't mentioned in her statement. Not because she had forgotten it, but because she had been turning it over since she left Josette's office, trying to decide if it was the kind of thing that mattered or only felt like it mattered. I told her to say it. She said it was about 6 months before the wedding. They were sitting in his car outside her building. He had driven her home after dinner somewhere, she couldn't remember where. They were talking, and then they weren't quite talking, the way conversations go when one person is thinking out loud, and the other is simply there. He had been in a good mood that night. According to Avia, he started talking about the future, about how things were finally lining up, how he was tired of juggling everything, how once the marriage happened, things would be different. Then he said something she hadn't fully understood at the time. He said that once everything was settled with the Odom family, he would finally be able to take care of her properly. Those were the words she remembered. He told her she wouldn't have to keep living the way she was living. He said he would get her name on something real, something stable, something nobody could take away. He talked about it like a man discussing a project already underway rather than a possibility. At the time, Avia thought he was talking about their future. Looking back, she realized she no longer knew what future he had been talking about. I did not speak for a moment. What mattered wasn't that Zach had announced some criminal scheme in exact language. He hadn't. What mattered was the pattern. The questions about ownership, the interest in succession, the business structures, the parallel relationship, the promises, the expectation. Standing alone, the conversation in that car could have meant several things. Placed beside everything else, it became harder to dismiss. He was discussing a future built on resources he did not yet have access to, but clearly expected to obtain. He was making promises based on an outcome he considered likely enough to speak about, as though it were already taking shape. And he was comfortable enough to do it in front of a woman he believed had nowhere else to go. I asked Avia if she remembered the conversation clearly enough to document it. She said she had already called Josette back before she called me. I sat with that for a long moment, the particular weight of a pattern that had revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, through people Zach Mercer had assumed would never compare notes. "Thank you, Avia," I said. She was quiet. Then she said softly, "Thank you for opening the door." She came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the parking garage call. I didn't know she was coming. Nadine buzzed my office and said Moselle was at the front desk. I told her to bring her back. She walked in wearing clothes that fit her well but looked like she had chosen them without thinking. The kind of dress that happens on autopilot when a person's attention is elsewhere. She sat down across from me in the chair where families sit when they have run out of ways to delay the conversation they came to have. She looked like a woman who had been revising her own memories for weeks and had finally grown too tired to keep revising. I didn't speak first. I let her arrive fully before anything else happened. She looked at Ernest's photograph on the desk for a moment. Then she looked at me. "I need to know," she said. "All of it." So I told her. I started with Avia Coles, not with the parking lot, not with my suspicions, but with who Avia was and what her life had looked like for 2 years. The car, the lease, the account. The 2 weeks she spent borrowing a colleague's vehicle and telling no one why. I told it plainly, without editorial, the way I tell families the things they came here to hear even when the hearing of it costs them something. Moselle sat very still. I told her about the Fulton County civil judgment. Aldous Greer, $63,000. A man who trusted Zach with numbers he should have verified and paid for that trust in a Fulton County courtroom. Then I picked up my phone. I told her I had saved a voicemail from the morning of her wedding. I told her she didn't have to listen to it if she wasn't ready. She held out her hand for the phone without a word. I pressed play and set it on the desk between us. His voice filled the room, composed for the first sentence, tightening through the second. And by the third, it was something else entirely. The charm was gone. What replaced it was the sound of a man who had just discovered that something he had planned around, counted on, mentally spent, was no longer where he had left it. He didn't shout. He was too controlled for that. But control under pressure has a sound, and that sound was in every word. Moselle listened to the whole thing without moving. When it ended, she set the phone down carefully, like something that needed to be handled gently now. I told her the last piece. Avia's formal statement to Josette, and what Zach had said in that car, 6 months before the wedding, access to the Odom business, spoken out loud to a woman he had made certain could not leave, because he believed that made her safe to speak in front of. Moselle was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me why I hadn't told her all of this before. I told her I had, once, the night of the engagement dinner. I had been specific and calm, and I had given her everything I knew at that point. She had made a choice with that information, so I made a choice with it too. I protected what I could protect, and I kept my door open, and I waited. The text was not a punishment. It was a mother who knew the business could be rebuilt after almost anything, but only if it was still hers to rebuild. I built the protection for the day she came back. I just hadn't known how long that day would take. Moselle didn't speak for a long moment. The office was completely quiet. Then she reached across the desk and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Some things don't need words once they've already been carried long enough. The work that matters most rarely announces itself. There was no courtroom moment, no public confrontation where everything unraveled in front of witnesses. What happened to Zach Mercer happened the way real, consequential things happen, through documents filed in county offices, through attorneys who speak in measured language, through the slow and certain movement of formal processes that do not hurry for anyone, but do not stop either. Josette filed for divorce on Moselle's behalf on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Moselle came to my office and put her hand over mine. The filing rested on facts that could be documented. The Fulton County civil judgment against Zach, Avia's formal statement, financial records, and the timeline of the parallel relationship maintained throughout the engagement. None of those things ended the marriage by themselves. Together, they created a record of who Zach had represented himself to be and what the evidence suggested had actually been happening during that same period. What the process produced was not an erasure. Marriages don't erase. What it produced was a clear, public, permanent record of how this one had actually been constructed, and by whom, and for what purpose. Zach's social presentation began dissolving in the community where it had always mattered most to him. The Fulton County judgment, now surfaced through the divorce proceedings, became part of the public conversation about who he was. Aldous Greer's name appeared in places Zach could not control. People who had vouched for him in professional circles began revising their vouching. The kind of reputation that takes years to build through careful charm and strategic generosity turns out to be surprisingly fragile when the record underneath it becomes visible. He had counted on no one looking. Several people looked. 2 organizations he had spent years trying to position himself around quietly stopped returning calls. A community development board, where he had been pursuing an advisory role, selected someone else. A commercial project he had hoped to join moved forward without him. Nothing dramatic, no announcements, no public shaming, just doors that had once opened becoming doors that remained closed. For a man like Zach, that was consequence enough. Avia pursued her own separate legal process. During her meetings with counsel, records were gathered regarding the vehicle, shared financial accounts, housing arrangements, and expenditures made in reliance on promises Zach had repeatedly made to her. Whether those facts supported a civil recovery was for her attorney to determine. The process belonged entirely to Avia, not to me, and I stayed out of it. Josette made the referral and stepped back. So did I. I had opened a door for Avia. What she chose to do after walking through it belonged to her. The business stood exactly as Josette had built it. When the divorce was finalized, Moselle's protected interest in the funeral home remained exactly where it had always been, preserved through the structure Josette had established months earlier. Nothing had been lost. Nothing had to be recovered through a fight. The protection had done what it was designed to do: keep a family asset separate from a marriage that never should have had access to it in the first place. On a Wednesday morning, 3 months after the filing, I was at work. A family had come in, a grandmother, 2 adult children, a teenage granddaughter who sat slightly apart from the others the way young people do when grief is still new enough to feel like something happening to someone else. I brought them water. I sat across from them. I listened to them tell me about the man they had lost, the way families do when they need the telling of it to be the beginning of carrying it. Moselle was at the desk in the front office. Not beside me. She had her own work to attend to. But present. Steady. The way a person is when they have stopped performing fine and simply become it. At some point, between one family leaving and the next arriving, I stood at the window where the afternoon light came through the way it always has in this building. I wasn't speaking to anyone, but I said it anyway. I didn't move. I didn't have to. I just made sure there was nothing left here worth taking, and everything worth keeping still standing.